So, about 3 years ago, I was still in my role as the chairperson for the Malta Council for the voluntary sector. And I was giving a presentation at one of our events, and I had this slide up. And I'm not sure if any of you who were there, were watching, will recognize it. And the subsequent slide, because the talk was about resilience and preparation for difficult times, how do you build your organization to be one that withstands stresses. The last slide of that presentation was this one. And it talked about resilience in people and resilience through collaboration, a lot of the stuff that's been talked about today. But if you read the last line, but we can't predict the future. This was 3 years ago. And none of us in that room would have ever guessed that we would have had a year like 2020, which still rolls over to 2021. And because of this, because we can't predict the future, therefore we need to be able to equip ourselves on a day-to-day basis to be able to deal with the trials and tribulations and the environment that we face on a day-to-day basis, because it is so unpredictable. And so therefore the best thing we can do, not to get too stressed about the stuff that's going on around us, is to work on ourselves. And we are most stressed when we are out of control. We feel most stressed when things aren't going the way we predict or the way we'd like them to. And so taking control of our space, our mind, our teams, our organization, our revenue streams is something that gives us the ability to actually stay objective and stay focused. And this is important now more than ever. In recent research, it's clear that the third sector is suffering from reduced fundraising income, obviously because of the pandemic. And this is also because of the amount of disposable income that people have, either because they've lost jobs or they've decreased their income, or businesses aren't doing well. And therefore, as a result, the knock-off effect is that people will buy the things they need to buy to live on a day-to-day basis and pay their bills. But what is left is very little. And therefore, that is typically what will go to the non-profit organizations and the charities. And unfortunately, also, we know that most of the charities and fundraising organizations depend on that money, that disposable income, to survive. There are some examples of organizations that are service providers, and those probably would have done better, although not great, but still have done better through the pandemic than those that perhaps only depend on charitable giving. The compounding factor is that the actual demand on your organizations has actually increased. And if you think about it, you've got this double-edged sword, the candle being burnt at both ends of the decreasing income streams and the increase in demand for services or support. Because essentially the social sector is keeping society together. You are the glue that holds society together when there is difficulty. And this goes back to times of war or times of crisis, all the way to economic crisis and obviously this pandemic. So in essence, the third sector is so important because it is the last line of defense, protecting those communities. And it mitigates social risk. As soon as things don't go to plan and people become vulnerable, or those that are vulnerable become even more vulnerable, it's the NGOs and the voluntary organizations that step in. And so their importance there is arguably even greater than the public sector and the private sector. Yet when we think about the resources that go to the third sector compared to the other two, it is significantly limited. So how do we sustain ourselves? How do we make sure that we are there to support the people we've committed our organization to help? How do we stay true to focus? How do we stay true to purpose when everything seems to be going against us? In essence, what we need to think about is the continuous planning process, really understanding how we need to work on organizations today in preparation for the future. Not for an outcome, not for the aftermath, not for the end of COVID, but to be better versions of ourselves on a continuous basis. And if we, instead of firefight all the time, although we feel we need to focus 100% on the firefighting, if we don't firefight all the time and we focus on planning, on developing, on working on our teams, on our skills, on our expertise, on the relationships with our donors, then we are going to become, by default, more sustainable than if we simply fight crisis. And so this resilience word comes in a lot, and obviously I work as a business coach with most organizations that are also suffering from an economic perspective, so business organizations as well. And they talk a lot about resilience. How do we weather the storm? And resilience is sort of this ability to pick yourself up when things don't go right, how to deal with adversity and challenge in a way that is proactive, that you come out the other end as unscathed as possible. And so this is something that requires experience. Actually, resilience requires difficulty to actually build it. But unfortunately, if we look at both the business sector and also the third sector, we think about the way we run our organizations as a finite game. Okay, so imagine, we talk about resilience in an athlete, someone that is planning to run a marathon. And they have a set goal in mind, they know the distance they need to cover, they have a date, and they're training for it. And they're building this resilience by pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. And then what happens is that if they do train well, they get to the goal. They cross the finish line, they're happy with their achievement, but then they need to start preparing again for whatever comes next. And so there is this sort of undulation of performance that, rather than being constant, is something that's driven by the finite game of achieving something. Okay, and we see other analogies. You hear Keith later on as well, probably talking about adventures of sort of climbing a mountain. This metaphor about accomplishing something, accomplishing a goal. What's your mountain? It's getting to the top of it and looking at the view from up there, and that's fine. That's motivating. It encourages people to push themselves out of their comfort zone. However, when you get to the top, there is an anticlimax. So this finite game, which we see in sports primarily, a football game has a defined time, and the goal is to score more than have been scored against you. And when the game's over, that's it. But the real world isn't like that. We need to think about organizations as something that are ongoing, that are sustainable. Because the average lifespan of organizations is shortening. Today, largely most organizations will exist for an average of 12 years. How old is your organization? How do you stay relevant beyond that sort of defined time, the average? How are you going to go beyond average? So the infinite game really talks about how we're going to restructure and rethink the way that we run organizations. And this is for leaders of you out there that are running organizations today. The infinite game has no rules. There's no rules. You need to be creative continuously to be able to invent new ways to do things. The example of online games and pub quizzes that are virtual. There are no rules now. You need to reinvent. There is no winner. It's not me against. It's not who raises most money. It's not me in my sector and I'm the largest because I raise most money. That doesn't work anymore. It's counterproductive. You can have many losers, but there is no winner. It's continuously striving to be a better version of yourself, not necessarily better than someone else. There are no set players. It's not us versus them. I hear conversations in boards that I'm involved in where we talk about us as the organization and them as the public sector, where we're getting grants, or the EU, or private enterprise. This us and them defeats collaboration. The mindset needs to shift because there is no winner at the end, so therefore the set players change. And today we're dealing with donors that are our typical donor, and tomorrow we're dealing with a new generation. There are no timelines. It's so funny to look at organizations plan budgets, saying that, in 12 months' time we're going to have this much surplus, or we're going to raise this amount of money, and we're going to work towards this particular goal. It's an arbitrary goal that, we match to a calendar. Who would have guessed, preparing their budgets for 2020, that they would have had a year like that? My challenge to you is to think differently about things like setting goals on the long term, but really think about how you can be more effective in doing what you're doing on a daily basis. And so yes, if you feel the need to have a budget just so you can plan and be organized, that's okay, but it shouldn't be your raison d'etre. Even project funding, this idea that we set up a project and we apply for funding, we're getting the funding for a defined period of time or a defined outcome, and then it stops. This is A bit like chasing your tail. Every time you finish a project, you have to figure out how you're going to get the funds for the next one. And so we need to start thinking about how to diversify our revenue streams. Most organizations have a mix. Yeah? Some organizations depend a lot on project funding. How can you try and balance that a little bit to be able to have ongoing sustainable revenue? Subscriptions, for example, is a great way to overcome this finite game of starting a project, finishing a project, getting the funding. And again, with no end game, with no finish, how do we celebrate? How do we know that we're being successful, that we're being effective? And this is how we measure impact. And again, let's measure impact on the outcomes that are happening in a more frequent way. This sort of annual report where we go back to shareholders or stakeholders in business or our donors at the end of the year and say, this is how much we've raised, this is what we've done with your money, this is how many people we've helped, are useful. But if we just simply look at the end goal, we perhaps don't focus too much on the way we're doing things, on quality. And so these intangibles are something that have to come into our everyday parlance as leaders when we're talking to our teams to make sure that we are talking about delivering the best possible with the resources we've got on a day-to-day basis and continuously striving to be better tomorrow than we are today. And this is not usual for us. If I speak to a CFO in a company and I say, right, scrap the annual budget, let's work on a rolling budget, they look at me with a quizzed look and say, well, how does that work? How do we know if we've achieved? So it's uncomfortable. And this change and shift towards this continuous momentum that we want to build in a cycle of change is something that's going to make most people uncomfortable. But actually, that's where we grow. The companies that are successful today and the organizations that are successful today did something in the past that was different to the ones that failed. They took risk, or even mitigated risk in different ways by creating new ways of doing things, new ways of being agile, new ways of adapting to change. And this requires us to be brave. Hence, the word brave in my title is really about us as leaders stepping out of that comfort zone and inspiring others to do the same. But it's stressful. If we think about optimal performance, whether you are a CEO or an athlete, it's really that sweet spot between too easy, where you're not challenged enough and therefore you take it easy and you don't push your limits, to too difficult, where you get overstressed and you get burnt out. That sweet spot in the middle is difficult to sustain. And so we need to go through cycles of rejuvenation, but also then going back into challenge. We need to continuously seek these challenges. And when you've got months and months and months of challenge that you're facing, as we have over the last 10 months, it starts to work negative effects on you, on your brain. Even if you think you're strong and you're used to this and you can carry it, don't underestimate the impact that this has on your mind and how that then affects your behavior in making decisions and also in leading your teams. So self-awareness for leaders is extremely important. We need to understand that stress is a benefit because it actually helps improve performance, but too much of it can burn us out and affect us negatively and the organizations and ultimately the beneficiaries. So here's a few things I want to share with you on my opinion, purely about how perhaps we might want to lead organizations coming out of this situation, where research by Chamber of Commerce and Vistage have shown that most business leaders today are looking forward to growth, looking forward to coming out of the pandemic from an economic perspective, looking forward to increased profitability, increased turnover, more investment in their businesses. And this is a sign that the after effect of that action, that positive action, is going to also help uplift the third sector through donations and more investment. So these are good signs, but we need to be agile now to be able to plan for those rather than just react. How do we start working differently with our partners to be able to work with them to help them achieve their goals so we can benefit, and ultimately not just us but the people that benefit from our organizational work. So the first part here is plan for always. So just don't plan for next year or the year after or some sort of strategic timeline. Plan for always. How can I plan to be better tomorrow than I am today? What do I need to do differently to know that I have scenarios in my mind that whatever happens, I've thought of it. Now, yes, arguably, black swan moments like the pandemic or the economic crisis 2008 were practically impossible to see. However, we can build resilience within our organizations by having this continuous planning process. And what this means essentially is that you need to take time to plan. You need to take time away from the crisis, away from the firefighting, and say, okay, where we're at, let's take stock, where we're going forwards in the short term. So plan for always. The second, which would be, did I go back? Can I go back? I think I pressed twice. There. Yeah. Number 2, back 1. Oops. There. Sorry. Manage risk. Now, some organizations have someone in accounts that can help, or maybe they have someone on their board of trustees that can help. But managing risk is something that's extremely important. And here I'm specifically talking about managing financial risk. Okay, making sure that you are putting money aside, making sure you are building strong cash flow values. Okay, these are extremely important. Most organizations would say that I would want to have at least in my bank account 6 months of salaries stashed away just in case. Okay, so this is about managing risk and also managing cash flow. And this is important for nonprofit organizations that either have projects that have dried up because of COVID or events that have been cancelled, to try and diversify those to be able to generate sustainable revenue in different ways. And the temptation, I know I've been there. I've been a CEO of nonprofit organizations for 20 years. The temptation is you have a bit of money stored and you go, you know what, we really need to buy this equipment to help this particular demographic. Or we really need to invest in more people so that we can deliver more of this service. Or we need to upgrade the therapists so that we can help more people. Fine, but be careful. You need to be able to manage risk first. It's the responsibility of the leader of an organization to make it sustainable. And as much as it might be aspirational to invest more in your purpose, you also need to make sure that you are managing risk financially. Number 3 is become, or if you already are, stay independent. Now, what do I mean by this? We have situations where we are asked to shift, perhaps, from our core purpose to accommodate for a funding stream. Okay, let's face it. Sometimes we have to say yes because that's where the money is. Now, there's a danger in that because when you become dependent on someone else rather than independent, it makes you less agile. It decreases your ability to shift, to actually quickly say, right, we're going to shift, we're going to do this instead of that. Because if you're not independent, then you need to ask permission. You need to get buy-in from other stakeholders. So to stay agile and be nimble, you need to be as independent as possible. And this is primarily related to your income streams or partnerships that you may have that might have restrictions in allowing you to make decisions. So you need to look at that, and perhaps even also with your trustees. Number 4 is collaborate. Now, I have conversations on a regular basis around this sort of mass number of non-profit or voluntary organizations in Malta. 1,800 at the last count. I am a firm believer that actually small independent organizations working in collaboration can be much more powerful than big, strong organizations. Because they can be more nimble, they can be more agile, and they're really working at the grassroots. But a small organization on its own won't last long. So whilst the majority of those 1,800 are small, pure volunteer-only organizations, I see very little collaboration. There is a competition for funds. There's a competition for the limelight. There's a competition for airtime. And if we start coming together, and for me, the perfect example is what we did with Razzetta Albeberia and Eden Foundation coming together as Inspire. That made us much stronger. So collaboration is something that will allow you to weather the storm because you have a network. You don't necessarily need to merge, but you need to have a network that is supportive and selfless. 5, invest in quality people. We may have the temptation as leaders to say, well, this person's been in this role, he volunteered so much of his time and now he's part of the organization. But are they fit for purpose? And I really don't want to come across as sort of, being unkind in any way. We must value our people and we must get the best we can out of them, but we also need to make sure that we are choosing the right people to work with us. And this also means that we need to bring in expertise and also people who perhaps have been involved in the corporate world to start working within our organizations, if not as paid staff, but also as volunteers. The experience that people can bring who are doing things properly, a CFO that has been in a business where risk management is something they talk about at their board meetings, is going to add a lot of value to the third sector because they are going to bring a professional approach, perhaps, to our organizations. They perhaps lack the purpose and the mission and the drive and the passion that comes innately for people that work within the voluntary sector. So the balancing act there is important. We don't want to be professional, that we become bureaucratic technical organizations. We need to make sure that we remain human, but we also need to make sure that we are investing in the right people to be able to professionalize our organizations. And that will allow us to weather the storm more effectively, and also to attract more talent who have a choice to work in the third sector or work in the public sector. And if we can attract those people to come and work with us, not by offering more money, but by offering more purpose and satisfaction, then we're going to strengthen our organizations and strengthen the sector at large. Number 6 is stay relevant. You may have founded your organization many years ago for a purpose that was clear. But do you revisit that on a yearly basis to see if you are still relevant? Is the problem you were trying to solve 5, 10 years ago still there today that requires your effort? Because we need to be brave around actually either stepping away or creating space for others to grow, or shifting, pivoting, focusing on other areas. And we've seen this within COVID significantly, the ability of organizations to pivot, either to go to online solutions, supporting their beneficiaries, or shifting towards food bank and food collection and feeding the hungry, instead of maybe other core competencies that they were focusing on. This ability to stay relevant is extremely important because it connects you with the people that are giving you their hard-earned money. They want to make sure that they are giving it to a cause that is not self-serving, but is community-serving. You recognize this guy, Charles Darwin. And I like this particular sort of quote because it's sometimes for leaders, this impression that we have to be the best, that we have to strive to be strong, we have to be brave, we have to be out there and we're better than others, we're competitive, we have the edge. But actually, if we think about, evolve, the third word, and evolution, Darwin's theory, it's not the best that survive. It's the ones that are most able to adapt. And this means self-awareness. It means self-reflection. It means looking at ourselves and saying, how do we need to change to be able to adapt to the situation that is unfolding? It's not about force. It's not about pushing harder. It's not about more spend on marketing budgets or fundraising initiatives. It's adaptation. And it's taking brave decisions to adapt, to let go of what you know and change. And it starts with us. As leaders, we need to be able to put our ego aside and adapt ourselves to the situation at hand. And that's the last point. A lot of people are talking about the new normal. For anyone's guess what that looks like, but we're starting to get some insight. But essentially, whatever that new normal is, what we need to do is reinvent ourselves to match it. If we want to survive, or even better, thrive in a new way of doing things, we need to be moving in parallel, not lagging behind. And so therefore, if there is one final thing that I'd like to say, is that you need to take time out. As leaders and your teams, you need to take time out of the firefighting to think, to plan for always, to find ways where you need to adapt. And this will allow you to become stronger tomorrow than you are today. Thank you.
Nathan, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I just wanted to ask you about what you think about the overall NGO sector in terms of fitness for purpose now, in the light of what's happened in the last 12 months and moving forward. Because everything, it seems, every industry, every vertical, every sector is reevaluating themselves. So for leaders of NGOs, and this could be small NGOs, just voluntary organisations, a few friends who've got together, these are obviously concerning times. So what would you think would be the one thing that they could do today to start moving forward in a new direction?
For me, it's learning. Learning either by collaborating or, working with people outside of the third sector to be able to learn new ways of doing things. And organizations and activities like this are perfect and timely because they are giving a different angle to how leaders can evolve within the sector. Looking at different ways, looking at technology, looking at different ways of fundraising, different ideas. This is really where we can be successful. But I think, again, it's really about making sure that leaders step up and really fight for that autonomy to be able to make decisions that are good for their organization and their beneficiaries, rather than perhaps the temptation to either go cap in hand to government or maybe the private sector and say, please bail us out or please help us, because those will come with strings attached. And we really need to make sure that the third sector is strong in itself as the third pillar of society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make, isn't it? We've seen a lot of, for want of a better expression, nanny state interventions going on. And one of the things that I'm keen to explore and to come out of today is how, as you just said, organisations can be more independent and how they can have better direct relations with the people who can help them. What would you think would be the best way for organisations to do that? Would it be to actually look at their corporate offering, look at how they are looking to potential CSR supporters, or would it be better to actually go for a bigger audience in terms of the public?
I think it's a mix, but actually I wouldn't look at it that way. I would say, if you think about great leaders, what they did is they went out there based on a purpose, and then others followed. So let's find ways to inspire people by, making change, by adapting ourselves, by, if necessary, reinventing the way we do things and ourselves to be able to make a difference. Let's make an impact, and then people will follow. And if we can inspire people, then they will give. What's important then is that we maintain that relationship. We can't just forget about someone that gave us even the little bit of money they had. We need to make sure that those people are being informed of what impact their money, if we're talking about donations, had on the community they care about. And so this synergy with the donor, the synergy with the giver, even it could be even a corporate, the synergies are important. And this is why collaboration for me is really about the total being more than the sum of its parts. It's not just an exchange of, you conscious cleanse by giving me money and I'll spend it for good. It's really about how can we collaborate to be able to make the outcome even better than the funds.
I think that's a really, really crucial point, and hopefully as we go now into the round table discussion, we'll be able to explore that a little bit more. But right now, I'd like to say thank you very much for a fantastic presentation, and best picture probably so far today, standing on top of a mountain. So I don't know if anybody's going to get any higher than that. Thank you very much.